All, I'd like to thank everybody and welcome to this the educational seminar, webinar, if you will, on background screening. We do, Kredifi started doing this background screening 101, basically educational series, and we try to do this every quarter. We pick different topics. The last one was in January, and that was more around the fundamentals of background screening, predominantly in the US and the overall in the market. But today, we're going to talk about international screening because that's a good segue and into the, from the very basics and also very critical. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this call. We're going to go for about 30 minutes. We'll go with some slides and some conversation between Andy and myself, and then we will open it up for Q&A in the end. You can unmute yourself in the end if you have questions. But before we get started, I'd like to welcome Andy to the call as a co-host, as a guest for this series. And Andy, I'll let him introduce himself, but Andy and I have known each other for almost 10-15 years now. We worked together at First Advantage. He's one of the experts. He's one of the best experts in the industry when it comes to international screening and overall screening. And with his experience and knowledge and expertise, we hope to make this a valuable session today for everyone. And we will keep this very informal. So the format really is just going to be, we'll switch between each other and talk about the different topics, and then sort of a panel, if you will, and a webinar or presentation, and then, open it up to questions. So Andy, if you want to introduce yourself and then maybe get started from there.
Sure. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk with you. As you said, we've known each other for quite a while, so it gets to the point that you're kind of hanging out with friends and not just working with colleagues, and that's nice. Let's see, so started out in the industry about 20 years ago, actually, at a company called ChoicePoint. Did a number of different things there, more on the US side, but moved into the international side of screening in about 2008, running the international business for ChoicePoint, which became LexisNexis. And then we got acquired by First Advantage, and that's where we crossed paths a number of years ago. But have been doing pretty much international since then. So a little over 15 years now, have lived and worked overseas, run teams around the world, and done a lot of client support as well with pretty major enterprise level customers in different geographies around the globe. Hold my privacy certification from the International Association of Privacy Professionals for both Europe and privacy management. Also have a fellow in information privacy, so I spend a fair amount of time dealing with privacy and compliance issues also. So kind of leave it at that, but get into the fun stuff and the information that people probably care a little bit more about. So I'm turning it back over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I remember my first day at First Advantage when I was hired and I was asked to handle India and APAC, and the first person I met was Andy. So that that I think in itself is is a testimonial. So all right, so we'll get started here, Andy. Let's and this session is being recorded, for everybody's benefit, and we will be able to share the recording. I'm gonna keep toggling and having the presenters here with the pictures, but usually we'll just focus on the content. So yeah, Andy, if you want to just kick it off with given your expertise about, what is happening in the world today, particularly global screening.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine it's a surprise to anybody that the world is becoming more global. Regardless of what you may know about global screening or not, I think everybody's pretty aware, and it was probably not caused by, but certainly accelerated by the pandemic, because everybody was working from home. Companies were forced to figure out how to do things remotely. So I think that really just exacerbated, accelerated, whatever word you want to use, a lot of trends that were already happening, right? Companies were already moving labor offshore a long time before the pandemic happened, but now I think different types of jobs were being moved offshore. Teams were becoming more distributed. Teams that might have all been in a corporate office now are spread across the US or spread around the globe. So I think it's just the way the world is moving right now is pushing on this. And there's some other things too that we'll talk about, but there's just this one overarching trend of globalization. And when it comes to the screening side of it, I kind of, was thinking about our presentation, Naveen, and why, how to kind of frame this up for people about why understanding global screening is important, and having some skill set in it. And I think if you were a US screening company only and you said, I'm really good at screening candidates from Virginia. I can do all the other states, but I just use a partner to cover the other 49 states and the territories, but I'm really solid in Virginia. You probably wouldn't sound that great to a client, right? Because the reality is people move around a lot. And even though maybe 80% of your candidates maybe are in Virginia, if you're working with more local customers, the reality is you're still going to have candidates that have background history all across the United States, and you need to be able to do that well. And I think ultimately that's what's happening right now in the global stage too, that no longer can companies afford to be able to say, I'm really good in the US, we have a great product. US, we don't do a whole lot of that, or non-US, we don't do a whole lot of that. Well, maybe we'll figure it out, but it's just not our strength. I think that's really going to set companies at a disadvantage as this world increasingly moves towards kind of being without borders to a certain extent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with the fact that companies are expanding. It's about remote work, which has now become the mainstay, if you will, right? So that's the other thing which is happening. And as a result, it has become very important. And I think when we were talking earlier, I mentioned that, cybercrime. I read somewhere recently that cybercrime is now the third largest economy, almost about 10.8 trillion, right behind US and China in itself. And when companies are looking to bring people on board, in different parts of the geographies, and we've seen that, with the rise of these PEO companies or employer of record companies like Deal and Velocity Global and Globalization Partners and Multiplier and Go Global, and Rippling and what have you, which are making things easier. So I think it's almost very critical in sort of in this picture to say, well, do you really know the person you are hiring or not? And it's kind of like common sense, as in when we buy products, we look at brands and look at the credibility. When we buy food, we look at the ingredients, whether they're healthy or not, and sometimes even look at where are they made, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to hiring people overseas, I think global, people across the boundaries, it becomes even more critical. So, I think, and I'll keep going here, and feel free to add anything, Andy. So I just wanted to throw some numbers in there to, for the benefit of people as to why this landscape is evolving and will continue to grow is, the hiring game itself is becoming very competitive overall. And I think if you look at the stats, it's astounding that, 62% of the American workers, were hired by international companies. So companies outside North America are hiring people here. And likewise, I think the number you had mentioned earlier, Andy, American companies, there are 66% of the companies, and maybe even that number of hiring, which is happening outside North America, so to speak. So it's actually working throughout. I think some of this data actually I picked up from an article which was talking about companies hiring across borders, and one of the key stats was Deal, which is, just to help people, Deal is not the actual deal people sign. It's a company called Deal, which is a PEO organization, professional employer organization. They signed 300,000 contracts. And so that happened. I think even the North American employers in the 3 years since the pandemic, they've seen almost 300% increase of people being hired in Central America and Caribbean, and likewise in Europe and East Asia, astounding numbers in growth and hiring across borders. And really, Andy, if you want to talk a little bit about the reasons which are there, why they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just mentioning the PEOs, the ease of hiring now is just so much just exponentially easier than it used to be 5 or 10 years ago. If you wanted to hire somebody in a foreign country, it was a bit of a challenge to say the least to understand how that would all work. And I think a lot of times, maybe you'd put them on a US contract and just have them kind of work remotely and semi under the table because they may or may not have been paying local taxes. But now, if you want to pay somebody to work in Bulgaria or Australia or Zimbabwe or whatever it might be, you can go work with a company like Deal or any of the other ones, and they take care of everything for you. So it's a really simple one-stop shop. And so, where the labor markets who are pushing towards BPOs and such for large scale hiring, in which case, yeah, you either work with the BPO and you just paid them, or if you're hiring your own folks, there was enough mass there to make it worthwhile. I'm hiring a team of 2 or 3 people maybe to do some development in Eastern Europe. Now that's really simple and easy to do. I could have known that the developers were there, that the wage rate was low, but at least the perceived obstacles to hiring overseas were so great before. Now those obstacles have been taken away. So I think that ease right there is probably one of the biggest things. And I think as the world becomes a smaller place, more and more people are becoming aware of the opportunities of having people in different geographies, whether it's development resources in one corner of the world, customer support in another, back office in yet another. I think companies are realizing that there's an advantage to it, as well as if they don't do it, they're going to be left behind. So I don't know there's really much of a choice in a lot of cases but to go this route.
Yeah, no, and I think, in terms of skills and cost, I think those factors always played a role in terms of companies looking for people, outside North America. But I think, and earlier it was just the big, large multinational Fortune 1000 companies who could, hire expensive attorneys and go through the uh, process of setting up their operations and then hire people. I think, as you rightly said, the two biggest things are the PEOs, which are they made a hiring people in any country just as easy with a click of a button, onboard them, and they
Mhm.
take care of everything else. And they make this global hiring possible much faster, much easier. And so now this is extended to a startup, 10 people. I just met a friend of mine. He started a company in AI, and he's got all of 12 employees. 4 are in Germany, 4 are in US, and 4 are in Bangalore in India, right? So even the smaller companies can do it. And last year we had one of our clients asked for background screening for international employees, and guess what? 80 some employees were all on Deal and maybe another PEO. And I think it's accentuated by the fact that remote hiring is sort of now become an accepted norm. People working anywhere in the country, anywhere, and anywhere in the globe, essentially. So, um,
Agreed.
yeah. So just kind of jumping on to the global screening, I mean, why is it really needed? I think, Andy, you can add to this, but 3 things which really come to my mind based on our experience really has been, it is, important to know when you're hiring people overseas, remote, you have to know who the person is, right? It's like really knowing your employee. That's, knowing the individual or the candidate, KYC or KYE or whatever it might be called. That's critical. I think in many cases, the customers may have their clients in their contract, sales contracts require that all of their employees, regardless of where they are, they should be hired. And then there is, obviously risk and company policy, so to speak. Any thoughts on that? I mean, particularly if you talk about regulations or security or SOC 2, Andy, if you want to add anything there.
Sure, yeah, I think that again, one of those things 10 years ago, 15 years ago, multinational company headquartered in the US, for example, without a doubt would have been screening their US employees, but their non-US staff maybe weren't getting screened, might have been getting screened by a small local provider, might have been to different standards. And again, as the risk mitigation market industry has matured, people are realizing there's exposure there, right? Just the same way that in the US, we used to screen employees, but often contractors were a little bit ignored. And now everybody, a lot of people, most people, hopefully everybody, realizes that contractors sometimes almost present more of a risk. They don't always go through the same training, the same awareness programs and stuff that your regular employees go through around phishing scams and cybersecurity. And back to your point about the fraud and cybercrime, frequently it seems like the contractors sometimes are the weak link there. So I think companies are also realizing that what's happening outside home country borders also pose a threat, maybe even a bigger threat sometimes, and they're trying to close up that weakness or shore up that weakness by expanding their screening programs, whether it is because a customer contract requires it, they have a certification that requires it, or they just realize that it's a big exposure if they don't. So in some cases, they're starting to screen. In other cases, they are really instituting a more global standard to make sure the screening's done to an equivalent level around the globe.
Yeah, my pet peeve, a few years ago, 10 years ago, when people would ask, why do we need to screen, my response was very simple. It was almost like when you have people working in the office, you can, obviously you screen them and it's great. And when this was the days when people, were everybody was going to office every day, and people had their offices, and so you can control access with the badges. Your badge will allow access to certain areas, and it will, forbid you to going into other places. Kind of things we see in sort of the movies with the CIA and the FBI operations and everything. So it was there, not quite to that level, but you could do that. But today, I think the facility is not as important as the infrastructure and the systems where companies will give access to, or people who will have access to a lot of the sensitive information and data and IP, and not to mention that if something is compromised, that could lead to hacking, and eventually, like we kind of talked about, cybercrime and so many other things. So okay. Just moving along, just want to be sensitive to time as well. So, this is an area I think, Andy, you can talk better than I can on what are the common global checks, and I've kind of segregated, the critical ones on the top and some of the others at the bottom. So I think you are the best person to speak here.
Sure. Yeah. And 100% on the slide breakout here. So, yeah, across the top row, an ID verification, criminal record check, education verification, employment verification. And my experience, that's usually 90% of the volume, give or take 5% or so. Those are the kind of core checks. I don't think it's really that much different in the US as a standard rule. Certainly across industries, it varies some. But that being said, there are countries and geographies where certain types of checks are much more common. So, for example, UK, a right to work check in the UK is required by all employers to do for anybody they're hiring. And so a lot of companies get involved in that process with right to work and as part of the screening process itself. There are regulated roles in the UK as well, require certain levels of screening or type of screening. So things like that that can be a little bit different. There's the core, but then where those, I don't want to say one-offs, but more country-specific searches come into place or come into play. That's where that extra knowledge is really important, because a standard employment or education verification doesn't vary tremendously around the globe, and the information you needed or how it gets fulfilled may change a little bit, but we're still talking about when did you graduate? Do you have a degree or not? What was your major? The same kind of questions. Or how long did you work there? What was your last job title? Would they rehire you or not? So those things be a little more consistent, but Some of those other checks around right to work can really vary a lot from country to country and whether they're even possible. So that's where some of the the experience and more specialized knowledge comes in, I think, with these things like social media checks. Yeah, I think it's really born out of the US is where it started. We're starting to see social media crop up. I know there's a provider, for example, in Europe that does social media checks, but in a lot of corners of the world, you really don't see those being done at all right now. A lot of the product set is really more kind of US specific at this point. But I'm pretty comfortable in predicting that 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, such things are probably much more commonplace around the globe.
Yeah, no, thank you. And right to work, I mean, it's very similar to I-9 verification in the US, right? I mean, I'm assuming that's kind of similar in many ways that you have the work permit, you are authorized, and certain other things. So countries will have different flavors, but I'm assuming that's what really it boils down to.
Yes, yeah, it is, and it's changed the way it used to be done to how it is done in some places. But yeah, essentially making sure the person has the right to work. The fine points around it, which is what can trip you up frequently about who can do it, how it's done, what paperwork needs to be
Yeah,
kept or
right.
not, what kind of audit trail you have to have, those kind of things, or where making sure you get it right is really important. Which
Yeah.
same thing in the US, right? If you don't do it the correct way, then you expose
The
yourself down.
employers can get in trouble. Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And you know, social media, I think I put it in there, and this is again coming from a fact that we were working with a client and you know, large Canadian e-commerce giant, very well-known brand, one of the high-flying you know, stocks of 2022, 23 before things kind of went south, but they've, you know, come back, was, you know, surprisingly hiring a lot of people in Eastern Europe and India and Asia and Canada and US. And they were, you know, they were doing social media checks for everybody. And I think their analysis or their need was primarily driven by generally getting to know the people, you know, the lifestyle, you know, what culture fit issues they might have, and especially in today's day and age, are there any, you know, biases or anything, you know, which may cause workplace issues or brand issues or whatnot? So that was kind of surprising, and we are seeing, you know, a lot more happen, and not, you know, a lot of companies looking at sort of looking at social media checks as well. So
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I can very clearly remember conversations in the conference rooms, offices, I don't know, maybe 5 years back, when social media products first came out, and working for some of the larger companies, the view is very, oh, there's no way this will fly. We can't do social media checks
right,
and never get
right,
accepted. And it was very much of a, there's no way this could ever happen. But if you look at it in the US right now, right, there's multiple providers, large kind of section of the population is doing them. And I wouldn't say it's 100% commonplace, but it's certainly not unusual, or you don't get the side eye if you say you're doing social media checks anymore. So,
right.
yeah, it's interesting how it's evolved in a fairly short period of time from a no way this is going to happen, this will never get past the attorneys or whatever, to now being fairly accepted in the market, at least in the US. And so that's why I think some of these things, yeah, it takes a little bit of time, but the writing's on the wall and where it's going to go.
Right, right. Um, so I think it was really, you know, it would be helpful for people to understand at a very high level, you know, what are these checks, how have they evolved, how are they done? So maybe we can spend, you know, a couple of minutes, couple of slides on talking a little bit about, you know, how the evolution has been, how are the checks done, particularly when it comes to international screening.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's, yeah, again, I think the US leads the charge in a lot of this, but the same trends happen elsewhere. Again, a story I remember one of my first trips over to India, actually, and this would have been LexisNexis days, to go meet with our vendor that we had in India doing criminal record checks for us, among other things. And they were explaining the process. And in that day, as you well know,
Right,
people were doing police record checks, right, or police station checks. And so someone would go into the police station and say, I want to see if Andy Hellman's got a criminal record. And so that police station is where you checked. It wasn't even Mumbai as a whole, it was this police district.
Right,
And at least in some of these places, they would bring out a binder
right.
of the results, and there would just be handwritten notes that Andy Hellman does not have a police record in whatever district, and so there's just the manual processing going on, and I kind of always wondered, well, does this really depend on how motivated whoever it is that's searching the file, the file cabinet in the back for records going through it? Are they really searching every page? Are they missing some pages in there where that record is or something? Or how is this happening? And fast forward to today, where there really is a more of a nationwide check. Is it 100% complete and thorough and no, but there is a database that you can search. You can do a more national level check. You're certainly not, in a lot of cases, I wouldn't say nobody does it, but most vendors aren't going into the police stations anymore to do the checks. Some go into the courthouse. Some will use a national database to do the checks. And so it's really evolved a lot in the past 5 or 10 years over there.
Right.
And you can see that example, across the globe. The UK is doing EID for criminal record checks. Canada started with EID by the out-of-wallet questions for their criminal record checks with Equifax, and has since evolved to also allowing the facial recognition with an ID document held up to the camera and stuff like that. So, and actually, in some cases, I think that this is kind of leapfrogging the US, especially with some of the EID solutions that they're doing around the globe right now. So, be interesting to see how much some of this then kind of comes back into the US from other localities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, your example of the police checks versus in just a period of last 6, 7, 8 years, going to a national court record check, for example, in India specifically, but the Face ID based and many of the other countries, leapfrogging how things are done in US. So, we can talk, more about once we, in terms of, I think it's important for people to know a little bit about what we call the other stuff. In this case, it's really the important stuff, which is, everybody, I think, has common questions about, what is the turnaround time and how much is it going to cost and what are the typical challenges? What things do I need to do? I think the biggest myth and the mystery is around, once you get past what is to be done, which I think most people understand, as you said, 90% is really just ID, criminal education, employment. Once you get past that, then the biggest thing is, well, how much is it going to cost and why does it take so long and so on. So, I'll talk a little bit and maybe you can add, but my take and my experience, when I worked with some of the larger global clients and even smaller clients today, like the ones where few months ago, we screened about 87 of their employees spread across 14, 15 different countries. The turnaround time really depends on what you're doing. I mean, it could be as little as one day if you're just performing a very simple global security database check, if you will, but maybe even potentially an ID check, a passport or something. But it could be as much as 15, 10, 15 business days, sometimes, almost a month. And that's because I think it depends on the country, really, where the checks are being done. It depends on what checks are being done. So in some places, I think, what most people need to recognize is that when you step outside North America, even in US, for example, we have limitations on how much is online versus how much has to be done, by people. But once you, walk into the international boundaries, I think it's important to understand that it takes a long time. Everything is manual. There are no databases. Things are evolving, as you pointed out, but we're not quite there. And so even today, a lot of the education verification, and I can speak as a specific example in India, for example, people will take a copy of the degree and go to the institute, and somebody will again pull out the in the registrar's office, somebody will look at the records and then stamp it, sign it, saying this is legitimate and it's verified. Employment like this in many other countries is very much the same. Assuming all the consent and all other compliance things are taken care of. So I think it's there. And if you have to do national criminal check in Denmark, we had a client we had to do once, or in another country, it requires certain additional paperwork, which adds to the time taken and so on. So the international criminal records. Even in many countries today, people go, Brazil and Latin America, even in Europe for that matter, I think they have to go to the courts and get the records and so on. So that's there, which is, kind of a good segue into, it costs so much more. I remember I was talking to a client in Korea and in Japan. That standard package, if you will, runs in the range of actually almost $300 to $500, per candidate, just because the costs are there and how things are done and so on and so forth. It's not easy. It takes a lot of effort, if you will. And lastly, I think it's all compounded by the fact that the country specific requirements are so different. And I put this thing, image of do you know the requirements to sell country eggs in Arkansas, for example? So in US alone, if you're doing different products, there are different states which will have requirements on what you can sell and how and so on and so forth. And so, think about what is being done. So do you want to comment a little bit about there on cost and the requirements on how for these country specific things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the requirements are the biggest thing around it. Certainly there's a lot of variation in detail and price and turnaround time and all those things. The biggest challenge is keeping track of it, and having some kind of way to know what are the requirements, how much does it cost, how long does it take? Because when we're all working with our clients, they need to know this. When you've got a candidate that's trying to submit their application, what do they need to give you? Having all that information up front is really key. So yeah, I mean, 100%, you hit it on the head. It varies tremendously. There are these kind of odd, just unique requirements. I saw one the other day. I've seen parents' names before. This one was actually going to great grandparents' names for a check. This was actually in a sub-Saharan African country. So, there's some really odd, unique requirements. You need somebody to keep track of all this. And that's one thing I always say, talking to people that maybe are starting to build out a global screening capability, is make sure you've got a good system for documenting all this, because it's just going to continue to grow. There's a lot of data there to keep track of.
Right, right. Okay, I think we kind of talked about this, but I'm curious. I think it'll be good if you want to kind of talk to how we created this and what impact this technology is going to have in the future of screening and global screening.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. So, for the audience's understanding, and when Naveen and I were kind of working on putting the deck together, I had seen this I don't know, article talking about some AI hacks, and one of them was creating PowerPoint presentations. So we took the outline we put together and put it into this tool here to see what it came up with, and it put together actually a fairly interesting slide deck. If we make it all the way to the slides, we'll point out some challenges with the AI as well. But it put this in, and a lot of the content, the text content on here, is actually generated by the AI without really any prompting from either Naveen or myself. But that just shows, I think the AI is going to have a lot of impact on the world of global screening in ways big and small. One of my favorite uses for Chat GPT is actually translations. Nothing is really perfect or great at translating without context to the conversation, but I've discovered ChatGPT, when prompted correctly, does a really good job of both translating as well as explaining that translation. And where there are challenges right now, sometimes in working with vendors around the globe, with getting data around the globe, often due to things like language difficulties, if that goes away, does that change the ability to do the work? Right now, if I'm doing verifications, for example, so education employment checks, I really need local language capabilities to be really good at it. There's some places where English will get you by. They may not like it, but will do it. Generally speaking, people like to talk in their own language. And if you call them in English in a country that doesn't speak English, the response time is usually not as good. Well, now if I could communicate fairly fluently in a local language using AI, what does that do to the fulfillment pipeline? How does that look after that?
Right.
Gathering the data. I mean, just a lot of things that could happen. And some of it's small and putting a PowerPoint presentation together, but some of it is, I think, potentially much more impactful for how we do our work, and what that will do to things like turnaround times, to cost and stuff like that. And I
Yeah.
don't know what you're seeing, you're even more on the technology side than I am, Naveen. What's your take on all this?
Yeah, no, I mean, what this is again, this small startup is just signed up. They have a platform called Weave.ai. Very, pretty good in terms of what they can do. And I completely agree with you. I think when it comes to handling these global checks at the local level, the local languages and the translation, I think is going to be critical. But in our conversation with this client, we actually embarked upon a pilot project to use their technology on Azure with our platform, really to for two, three things initially to test out. One is looking at the report, the PDF we create, that platform will actually create a summary of the report, which can go straight on the top or at the bottom of the report, so making it easier to read for anybody who wants to spend maybe less than 20 seconds looking at the report. That was one thing. We are also looking at adding adjudication as one of the other capabilities on that feature. So this is going to change on how things are done. It's going to have a huge impact on the speed, on the turnaround time. Hopefully will impact in terms of being able to reduce the cost as well to some extent, mostly on the fulfillment side, the operational side. So clearly that will there is more which is coming, and I think everybody should be aware of what how it's going to change the overall background screening and the checks which are done. So I think we talked a little bit about just moving along on the country specific requirements. And again, this is a courtesy Andy's adventurous foray into the AI for content. This was another one which was a nice slide created about country specific requirements. So Andy, anything else? Anything you want to add? Otherwise, we can move.
No, before I want to, because I know we're getting close to the end of time here, get to that one slide that we talked about. Yeah,
Yeah.
this one here, this is the one thing that I would maybe kind of close on as a caveat, because it applies not just to AI, but to vendors in general. So, we just talked about top destinations and what are the countries, and the AI plugged in the text underneath all these, and it's not correct. I don't know really where it got the exact information for all this, but yeah, if I look at United Kingdom, for example, it's actually a very centralized system for criminal record checks. And while the application is a little bit of a pain, the process itself is fairly easy. And so it's interesting with AI. Sometimes it can be great, but it can spit out information that isn't always 100% correct. And that's where I think the challenge with global screening comes in, not just with AI, it's certainly part of it, but with any of what you're getting around the globe and the vendors is really understanding what's under the hood. When someone says I can do a criminal check here and it seems pretty fast and pretty cheap, well, great, but what are you getting for it? I
Right.
think that's the really, if I would leave a key takeaway for the audience from the presentation today, it's to, ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to dig in. Don't be afraid to appear ignorant about it. Make sure you really understand what you're getting, because at the end of the day, it can be misleading or incorrect if you don't understand what you're buying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, while the AI did a pretty good job of kind of highlighting the top destinations, the content there was not really accurate. And so we will continue to run with the risk and challenges. And, for the audience, it's important to understand, who you're working with. Well, what do you want to do, first of all? What is the cost benefit analysis and compare apples to apples, essentially. So are you getting the same thing? What vendors you use, so on and so forth. So I think really just important to, know why you're doing, what checks you're doing, and then which partner you're working with, and and what is the cost benefit analysis and the turnaround time. Really, it just boils down to that. So in the interest of time, just moving along, I think just to kind of round it up with, how do you go about, what do you know? And once you have some fundamental covered, you made a decision what you want to do. I think there are some important factors on, which partner you go with. And I think suffice to say that, we kind of talked a little bit about the reputation of the partner, the ability to provide local knowledge, and make sure what you get for what you ask for, what's the value for money. And, if you're working with 3, 4 different vendors, it's important to reconcile the offering to the same level. And I think, technology for, all reasons we talked about, whether it is AI or whether it is, speed or enablement or streamlining of the processes. And even in some instances, as simple as, are you dealing with one single platform which can support you for global versus many others? I think it's going to be critical. Anything to add, Andy? Otherwise, I think we are getting down to the last slide here and to wrap it up.
Yeah, no, I think that sums it up well. And yeah, I think we're good.
Okay. Again, we kind of talked about the future of global screening. I think it's important for people to pay attention on, how things are getting automated. What role is AI going to play? The world of regulation will keep changing in US, in every country around the globe. I think, data privacy around data access and data storage and so on. So important to keep an eye on important trends. Globally changing environment, workforce, where people are hired, what kind of people are hired, regulations. I think in all of this, sometimes it's forgotten that the demographics is changing rapidly as well. So, when you work with the millennials, the Gen Zs, the Gen Alpha now, and so on, it's important for companies to keep up and important for employers or clients to look at, whether the vendors are able to support that. So with that, I think it's a wrap. We can, we can stop here and open it up for Q&A. Okay, is there anybody who wants to go with a question? You can unmute yourself.
We did such a good job that there's just no question to ask at this point, Naveen.
Yeah, if people can ask in chat if there is anything. All right. I think looks like it was. I'm hoping the session was helpful. Like Andy said, I think we hopefully did a pretty good job, a fair job of educating the audience here. This session will be recorded and we'll make it available for your viewing or sharing later on with your colleagues. And with that, thank you everybody for joining today. And Andy, thank you so much for making the time. I think this was wonderful. I couldn't have done this without your support here. So thanks again.
Sure, my pleasure. I always enjoy talking, and thanks to all the audience for joining us.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a rest of the day, good evening, or good night, depending on where you're joining from. Thanks again. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.